who drove a beat-up Honda and split rent 3 ways. Landon had ambition, charm, and a smile that made me forget I was the one with $12 million in the bank. My grandfather's inheritance, my safety net, my future. After the wedding, I did what I thought love looked like. I shared everything. Joint trust fund. His name on accounts. A black card with no limit tied directly to my primary account. We bought the house in Coral Gables together. The luxury cars flew first class to Europe 3 times a year. I paid for everything and told myself it didn't matter because we were building our life. That life started cracking 6 months ago when the business trips became constant. New York, Dallas, Vegas, Seattle, every week a different city. A different excuse about important clients and urgent meetings. I stayed home in that enormous house, waiting for calls that came later and later, shorter and shorter. 2 days into what was supposed to be his Seattle trip, my friend Corinne called me in a panic. She'd just seen Landon at Zuma, the Japanese restaurant in Brooklyn. He wasn't in Seattle at all. He was 20 minutes from our house, holding hands with a blonde woman in a red dress. I opened my banking app with shaking fingers. The black card had real-time transaction tracking, something I'd set up years ago and never looked at again, because I trusted him completely. The charges told me everything. Zuma, the night before, $1,200. Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Brickell, premium suite, 2 nights. Tiffany & Co., $3,500. He'd never gone to Seattle. I scrolled back through 6 months of statements, and my stomach turned. Every single business trip had the same pattern: luxury hotels, expensive dinners, jewelry stores, designer boutiques. Tens of thousands of dollars spent on someone who wasn't me. I sat there staring at my phone, at the evidence of 6 months of lies funded entirely by my own inheritance, and something inside me went cold and clear. This is a long story, and I need someone to walk through it with me. If you want to hear how I made him pay for every lie, every dollar, every moment he thought I was too naive to know to stick around, you won't want to miss what happens next. I called my attorney before I even stood up from the couch. Nathan had handled my family's legal affairs for years, and I told him to start recording everything immediately because I was about to confront my husband and I wanted every word documented. Then I went upstairs and put on my black dress, the one that cost more than Landon's first grand, fixed my hair and makeup until I looked absolutely perfect. I wanted to look like the woman who owned everything he'd been taking for granted. The drive to the Mandarin Oriental felt surreal. Nathan stayed on the phone with me the whole time, his calm voice keeping me focused while my heart tried to beat out of my chest. The hotel lobby was all polished, marble, and soft lighting, the kind of place Landon had gotten comfortable visiting on my dime. I walked straight to the concierge and asked her to send a bottle of champagne to room 1847, Landon Torres's suite. I told her to include a note saying it was from his wife, Gemma, as a surprise. The concierge's professional smile never wavered as she confirmed the delivery. I settled into a velvet chair in the lobby with a clear view of the elevators and waited. Nathan was still on the line, silent but present, recording everything. 15 minutes later, the elevator doors opened and Landon practically stumbled out, his eyes wild and searching. Behind him came the blonde from Corinne's description red dress, expensive highlights, completely panicked. I stood up slowly, and the moment our eyes met, all the color drained from his face. He started stammering immediately about explanations and mistakes, but I held up my hand and cut him off. Then I turned my attention to the woman and asked her name. She told me it was Tessa, her voice trembling. I introduced myself as Landon's wife of 5 years and asked if she'd known he was married. The devastation on her face told me everything. She explained that he'd told her he was divorced, that his ex-wife had taken everything in the settlement, that he was rebuilding his life from scratch. I actually laughed a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the marble. I told her the truth about the necklace she was wearing, the one my black card had paid for 3 days earlier. $3,500. I told her about the suite, about every gift he'd given her over the past 6 months, all purchased with my inheritance. Tessa ripped the necklace off and threw it at Landon's feet, screaming at him about what a disgusting liar he was before running toward the exit in tears. Landon tried to grab my arm, tried to tell me it was all a mistake and that this woman meant nothing to him. I jerked away from his touch and laid out exactly what 6 months of nothing looked like: $68,000 in hotels, restaurants, and jewelry for his mistress. Then I held up my phone so he could see the screen clearly. I asked Nathan to confirm on speaker that he was recording our entire conversation, and my attorney's voice came through crystal clear, saying every word was documented. I watched Landon's face change from desperate to terrified. I told him the black card was canceled effective immediately, and I opened my banking app right there in the lobby and blocked it with a single tap. I informed him that I'd filed for divorce that afternoon, and that he had 24 hours to get out of my house before I called the police. He started babbling about his rights, about marital property, about how we'd built everything together. I asked Nathan to explain the reality of the situation. My attorney's voice was professionally cold as he laid it out. Every asset in question had come from my premarital inheritance. The prenuptial agreement Landon had signed was crystal clear in cases of proven infidelity. He retained no claim to anything, and we had 6 months of documented evidence showing he'd been committing adultery funded directly by me. Landon seemed to crumble against the wall, suddenly looking small and pathetic. He told me he had nowhere to go, that he didn't have anything. I picked up my purse and headed for the exit. I told him he should have thought about that before he destroyed a marriage to a woman who'd loved him and given him a life most people only dream about. All for a blonde in a red dress who hadn't even known his real name. I walked out into the humid Miami night without looking back. Over the next few days, Nathan coordinated everything: restraining orders, asset documentation, divorce filings, but it was during his investigation for the proceedings that we discovered something that made my blood run cold. Landon hadn't just been seeing Tessa. Nathan found evidence of 3 other women in different cities: New York, Dallas, and Las Vegas. All of them believed they were dating a successful financial consultant who traveled for work. All of them had received gifts, expensive dinners, hotel stays. He'd been using my inheritance to fund 4 simultaneous relationships. I sat in Nathan's office, staring at the evidence spread across his desk: credit card statements, hotel receipts, jewelry store invoices, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about one affair or one lie. This was systematic, calculated. He'd turned my generosity into a business model for deception. But as sick as it made me feel, it also gave me something I desperately needed: clarity, power, undeniable proof that would destroy any claim he tried to make in court. The question now was what else Nathan would uncover in the financial records, and exactly how deep Landon's betrayal really went. The divorce proceedings moved fast, but Nathan's investigation moved faster. 3 days after the confrontation at the Mandarin Oriental, he called me into his office with a tone I'd never heard from him before, something between anger and disbelief. He had my financial records spread across the conference table like evidence at a crime scene. I sat down and braced myself. Nathan explained that he'd traced every transaction on the black card for the past 18 months, not just 6. The pattern went back further than I'd realized. What I'd thought was the beginning of Landon's affair was actually just when he'd gotten bolder, less careful about covering his tracks. The total amount made my stomach turn. Over $120,000 spent on his other lives. Not our life, his secret ones. But it was worse than just the money. Nathan had cross-referenced the charges with Landon's supposed work calendar, the one he'd always shown me so carefully when planning his trips. Every single business trip had been a lie. The clients he'd mentioned didn't exist. The conferences he'd attended were fabricated. He'd been building this web of deception for over a year and a half, and I'd never questioned any of it because I'd trusted him completely. Nathan slid a folder across the table, toward me. Inside were printed screenshots from social media accounts I'd never seen before. Landon had created an entire alternate identity online, different last name, different backstory. In these profiles, he was a divorced entrepreneur who'd lost everything to a vindictive ex-wife and was building his fortune back from scratch. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't made me want to throw up. There were photos of him with each woman. Tessa in Miami, obviously. A redhead named Vanessa in New York. She worked in fashion and looked exactly like the type who'd fall for a struggling budding businessman with a good smile. Another woman named Claire in Dallas, a nurse who probably saw him as a stable, successful partner. And the last one, Madison, a grad student in Las Vegas who couldn't have been older than 20. He'd told each of them a slightly different version of the same story, tailored to what would make them feel special, needed, important. The successful consultant helping the fashion designer make connections. The stable partner for the nurse tired of dating immature men. The worldly mentor for the young graduate student. Nathan had even found the emails. Landon had been sloppy with the secondary email account, and my attorney had been thorough. Months of messages to each woman, carefully scheduled so they never overlapped, never suspected. He'd told Vanessa he loved her. He'd told Claire she was the one he wanted to build a future with. He'd told Madison she was mature beyond her years and he couldn't wait to introduce her to his family once things settled down with his business. The family he'd been referring to was me. The business that needed to settle was our marriage. I sat there reading through the messages, and something strange happened. The hurt started transforming into something harder, sharper. Every lie I uncovered made me more determined to make sure he lost everything. Nathan told me that all of this evidence made our case airtight. Landon couldn't claim he deserved anything from the marriage when we could prove he'd systematically defrauded me while committing adultery with multiple partners. But there was something else. He pulled out another document, bank statements from an account I'd never seen before. Landon had opened a separate checking account 8 months ago and had been funneling money from our joint trust fund into it. Small amounts at first. 500 here, 1,000 there. Nothing that would trigger alerts. But over 8 months, it added up to $47,000. Money he'd hidden from me. Money he was planning to use for something I didn't yet understand. Nathan said he was still tracing where that money had gone. But the transfers stopped abruptly 3 weeks ago, right around the time I'd started noticing Landon acting more distant than usual. More nervous. I asked Nathan what he thought it meant. He looked at me with the careful expression of someone about to deliver bad news and told me he believed. Landon had been planning to leave. The hidden account, the escalating affairs, the increasingly careless spending it all pointed to someone preparing an exit strategy. Nathan suspected Landon was going to clean out whatever he could access and disappear with one of his other women, probably claiming some fake emergency or business opportunity. I'd simply discovered the truth before he could execute his plan. The thought made my blood run cold. He hadn't just been cheating, he'd been preparing to abandon me completely after draining as much as he could from my inheritance. I would have woken up one day to find him gone, our accounts emptied, and probably some bullshit note about needing to find himself. But I'd found him first. Nathan said we needed to freeze all remaining joint accounts immediately and document every asset before Landon could hide or liquidate anything else. He also suggested I change the locks on the house and the security codes. Landon's 24 hours to move out had passed, and Nathan didn't trust him not to try something desperate. I agreed to everything. Then I asked Nathan to do one more thing. I wanted him to contact the other women. All of them. I wanted them to know the truth about who Landon really was, and I wanted them to have the option of providing statements for the divorce proceedings if they chose to. Nathan raised his eyebrows at that request, but I explained my reasoning. These women weren't my enemies. They were victims of the same con I'd fallen for. They deserved to know, and their testimony would bury any sympathy Landon might try to generate in court. Plus, I had a feeling that once they knew the full scope of his lies, they might have information I didn't. Details about where money went, what Landon had told them about his plans. Maybe even evidence of other schemes I hadn't uncovered yet. Nathan nodded slowly and said he'd reach out to them through a private investigator to maintain attorney-client privilege and protect everyone involved. I left his office that day with a folder full of evidence and a clarity I'd never felt before. Landon hadn't just betrayed me, he'd underestimated me. He'd thought I was too trusting, too naive, too comfortable in my privilege to ever question him. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he'd been. The private investigator Nathan hired worked fast. Within 48 hours, he'd made contact with all 4 women, Tessa, Vanessa, Claire, and Madison. Their reactions were almost identical. According to the investigator's report, shock, then denial, then fury. But it was Tessa who called me directly. I was sitting in my home office, the one I'd barely used in years because I'd been too busy playing the role of supportive wife. When my phone rang from an unknown Miami number, something told me to answer. Tessa's voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying for days. She told me she was sorry, that she'd had no idea, that she felt sick about the whole thing. Then she said something that changed everything. She told me Landon had been planning to propose to her. I sat there gripping the phone, trying to process what I was hearing. Tessa explained that 2 weeks before I'd discovered everything, Landon had taken her to Key West for the weekend and had hinted that he was ready to make things official. He'd told her he was finally closing a major business deal that would set them up for life. And once it went through, he wanted to get engaged. The business deal that would set them up for life was my money. He'd been planning to take whatever he could from me and start over with her. Tessa was sobbing as she told me this, apologizing over and over. But I wasn't angry at her anymore. I was calculating. I asked her if she still had any of the messages where Landon talked about this deal. She said she had everything. Texts, emails, voice messages. He'd been so excited about it that he'd sent her photos of houses they could buy, cars they could drive, the life they'd build together. I asked if she'd be willing to share those messages with my attorney. There was a long pause before Tessa said yes. She told me she wanted to help, that she felt like an idiot for believing him, but that she wanted to make sure he couldn't do this to anyone else. Over the next week, all 4 women agreed to provide statements and evidence. The private investigator compiled everything into a report that was devastating in its completeness. Vanessa in New York had been told Landon was developing a real estate investment app and needed capital to launch it. He'd asked her for money, $20,000 that she'd given him from her savings. Believing she was investing in their future together, Claire in Dallas had been told Landon was dealing with legal bills from his divorce and needed help covering costs temporarily. She'd paid for several of his trips, thinking she was supporting him through a difficult time. Madison in Las Vegas was the only one he hadn't directly asked for money. Probably because she was a student with nothing to give. But he'd been grooming her, according to the investigator's assessment, talking about how once she graduated and started her career, they'd be an unstoppable power couple. Each woman had been selected carefully, manipulated strategically, and lied to completely. But it was something Vanessa mentioned in her statement that made my blood run cold. She said that about a month ago. Landon had asked her hypothetically how hard it would be to transfer large amounts of money offshore without it being traced. He'd framed it as curiosity about his wealthy clients, but now she realized he'd been asking for himself. Nathan immediately brought in a forensic accountant. It took the accountant 3 days to find what Landon had been hiding. That $47,000 in the secret checking account, it hadn't stayed there. He'd wired it in small increments to a cryptocurrency exchange, converted it to Bitcoin, and then transferred it to a digital wallet that wasn't connected to any account in his name. He'd been converting my money into untraceable assets. The accountant estimated that if Landon had continued on his trajectory, he would have eventually done the same with much larger amounts from the joint trust fund. The pattern suggested he was testing the process, making sure he understood how to move money without triggering bank alerts or leaving a paper trail. Nathan filed an emergency motion to freeze all remaining assets and to compel Landon to reveal the cryptocurrency wallet information. The judge granted it within 24 hours based on the evidence of financial fraud. That's when Landon finally hired a lawyer of his own. His attorney reached out to Nathan with a settlement offer that was almost insulting in its audacity. Landon would agree to a quick divorce and wouldn't contest the prenup if I gave him $200,000 as a gesture of goodwill for the years he'd spent supporting my lifestyle and emotional well-being. Supporting my lifestyle with my money. While planning to rob me blind, Nathan asked me how I wanted to respond. I told him to reject the offer and inform Landon's attorney that we'd be pursuing full criminal charges for fraud and theft in addition to the divorce proceedings. I wasn't interested in quick and quiet. I wanted every detail exposed in court. I wanted a judge to hear exactly what he'd done, and I wanted it on public record so the next woman who searched his name would find the truth. Nathan smiled when I said that the first real smile I'd seen from him through this entire nightmare. He told me he'd been hoping I'd say something like that. Landon's attorney called back within an hour, suddenly much more interested in negotiating. But I was done negotiating. I'd spent 5 years compromising, accommodating, trusting. Look where it had gotten me. The trial date was set for 6 weeks out. Nathan assured me that with the evidence we had, the outcome wasn't in question. The only thing left to determine was exactly how thoroughly we'd destroy Landon's claims and reputation in the process. I spent those 6 weeks preparing, not just with Nathan, but with myself. I worked with a therapist to process the betrayal, joined a support group for people who'd experienced financial abuse, and started rebuilding my identity as someone separate from my marriage. The women Landon had deceived became unlikely allies. Tessa and I started meeting for coffee. She was funny, smart, genuinely kind, everything I might have liked about her if we'd met under different circumstances. She blamed herself for not seeing through Landon's lies. But I reminded her that I'd lived with him for 5 years and hadn't seen through them either. He'd been that good at deception. But what Tessa told me during one of our coffee meetings gave me the final piece I needed. She mentioned that Landon had a storage unit he'd rented about a year ago, claiming he needed space for client files from work. She only knew about it because she'd helped him move some boxes there once. I immediately told Nathan, who got a court order to search the unit. What they found inside made everything else look like amateur hour. The storage unit was in a facility off the highway in Hialeah, the kind of place where people keep things they don't want found. Nathan called me from the location with the police and a locksmith standing by. He wanted my permission before they cut the lock, even though the court order gave him full authority. I appreciated the consideration, but I told him to open it immediately. What they found inside was a complete alternate life, carefully organized and methodically hidden. There were boxes of documents, fake business and corporation papers for companies that didn't exist, forged letters of recommendation, printed email chains with fictional clients. Landon had built an entire false professional identity, complete with a website for a consulting firm that was nothing but a convincing front. But it wasn't the fake business materials that made my hands shake when Nathan sent me photos. It was the personal items. Clothing for all 4 women, still in shopping bags with receipts attached. Jewelry he hadn't given them yet. Each piece in a labeled box with a name and an occasion written on top. Vanessa Valentine's Day, Claire 6-month anniversary, Madison graduation gift. He'd been planning months ahead, budgeting my money for future manipulations. There was a burner phone with multiple messaging apps, each one dedicated to a different woman. He'd been keeping everything compartmentalized, making sure the wrong message never went to the wrong person. And then there were the files. Nathan found an accordion folder filled with financial documents I'd never seen before. Loan applications in my name that had been denied. Apparently, Landon had tried to take out credit using my assets as collateral without my knowledge. Insurance policies on our house and cars where he'd changed the beneficiary information to himself. Even a forged power of attorney document that looked legitimate enough to fool someone who wasn't paying close attention. He'd been building the infrastructure to take everything. But the most chilling item was a notebook. Handwritten pages in Landon's neat script, detailing what the forensic accountant later called a exit strategy timeline. It laid out his entire plan month by month. Month 1 through 6 had already passed. That was the testing phase, where he'd moved small amounts of money into cryptocurrency and established relationships with the other women. Month 7 through 12 was the scaling phase. He'd planned to gradually increase the amounts he converted and hidden, while also applying for credit cards and loans in my name to maximize available cash. Month 13 was listed simply as execution. According to his notes, that was when he'd planned to wire the maximum possible amount from our joint accounts into untraceable assets, claim a fake business emergency that required him to travel to Southeast Asia, and disappear. He'd estimated he could extract somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million before I realized what was happening. The other women were never part of his endgame. They were diversions, practice runs, and alibis. The notes made it clear he'd planned to cut contact with all of them once he vanished. Nathan photographed every page, every document, every receipt. The storage unit was a prosecutor's dream evidence of premeditated fraud, forgery, and theft, so well documented that Landon had essentially built the case against himself. But there was one more thing in that unit that broke something inside me. In a small box at the back, Nathan found a thumb drive. When the digital forensics team examined it, they discovered it contained copies of all my personal documents, passport, social security card, birth certificate, banking information, everything someone would need to steal an identity. There were also files filled with research, articles about how to disappear completely, how to establish new identities in countries without extradition treaties, how to move money through cryptocurrency into offshore accounts that couldn't be seized by U.S. courts. Landon hadn't just been planning to rob me. He'd been researching how to become someone else entirely, leaving me to deal with the financial wreckage and possibly even identity theft. The man I'd married, the man I'd loved and trusted and built a life with, had spent at least a year carefully planning my destruction. Nathan told me that with this evidence, we could push for criminal prosecution that would put Landon in federal prison for years. The fraud was extensive enough and premeditated enough that the district attorney would absolutely be interested. I sat in my car outside that storage facility for an hour after Nathan called, just trying to breathe through the weight of it all. Part of me wanted to see Landon locked up, wanted him to face real consequences for what he'd planned to do to me. But another part of me just wanted it over. Wanted him out of my life completely. Wanted to stop spending every day consumed by his betrayal. Nathan told me I didn't have to decide immediately. But he needed to know my direction soon, because the criminal case would affect the timeline of the divorce proceedings. I drove home in a daze, and that's when I found the letter. It was taped to my front door. Not mailed, hand-delivered. My name was written on the envelope in handwriting I didn't recognize. Definitely not Landon's. Inside was a single page from someone who signed herself only as a friend. She wrote that she'd been Landon's girlfriend before he met me, that they dated for 2 years before he suddenly broke up with her and married me 3 months later. She said she'd stayed quiet all these years. But after hearing through mutual friends about our divorce, she felt I deserved to know the truth. Landon had broken up with her immediately after I'd mentioned my inheritance on our 3rd date. She'd found out later from a friend that he'd specifically asked questions about me at a party, whether I was really as wealthy as people said. Whether the money was trust fund or inheritance, whether my family was involved in managing it, he'd targeted me deliberately. The letter continued with details that made my stomach turn. This woman explained that during their relationship, Landon had been obsessed with get-rich-quick schemes and constantly complained about being stuck in a mediocre life. He'd told her multiple times that he was too smart and too ambitious to stay middle class, that he just needed the right opportunity. Apparently, I had been that opportunity. She apologized for not reaching out sooner, said she'd convinced herself she was just bitter about the breakup. But now, seeing that he was facing fraud charges and that there were other women involved, she realized she'd witnessed the early version of exactly who he'd become. She ended the letter by saying she hoped I destroyed him in court and that if I needed her testimony about his character, she'd be willing to provide it. I sat on my front steps holding that letter as the sun set over Coral Gables, and something inside me finally settled into absolute certainty. Landon hadn't fallen out of love with me or made mistakes or gotten swept up in temptation. Our entire relationship had been a con from the very beginning. Every smile, every kiss, every moment I'd treasured all of it had been part of a long game to access my money. I'd never really had a husband. I'd had a very patient thief. The next morning, I called Nathan and told him I wanted to pursue everything the criminal charges. The full civil case, public testimony, all of it. I wasn't interested in protecting Landon's reputation or making this easy for him. He'd spent years making calculated moves to destroy my life, and I was going to make absolutely certain he faced every consequence. Nathan got to work immediately. With the evidence from the storage unit, the statements from the 4 women, the testimony from Landon's ex-girlfriend, and the forensic accounting reports, we had what he called a nuclear option case. But I wanted to be smarter than just overwhelming him with evidence. I wanted to understand his weaknesses, his pressure points, the exact ways to make sure he couldn't wiggle out of this. That's when I decided to look deeper into Landon's professional life. I'd never really questioned his job before. He said he was a financial consultant, and I'd believed him because why wouldn't I? But now I wondered what else he'd lied about. I hired a private investigator separate from Nathan's team to dig into Landon's employment history. What she found was fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. Landon did work at a financial consulting firm in Miami, but he wasn't the successful advisor he'd portrayed himself to be. He was a mid-level associate who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times in the past 4 years. His sales numbers were mediocre at best, and according to internal reviews the investigator obtained through a source at the company, Landon was considered unmotivated and unlikely to advance. The investigator also found something else. Landon's company had strict ethics policies about personal trading and financial management. Employees were required to disclose any accounts over $50,000 and any outside business interests. Landon had never disclosed our joint trust fund or the black card access he had to my accounts. According to the company's policies, that was a fireable offense, especially since he'd been using company resources and time to manage what they thought were his personal investments but were actually my money. I asked the investigator to document everything and prepare a report that could be submitted to Landon's employer. Then I started looking at his social circle. Landon had friends from college, buddies from work, a regular poker group he claimed to play with twice a month. I'd met most of them over the years at parties and dinners, and they all seemed to like and respect him. I wondered what they actually knew. I reached out to a few of the wives and girlfriends, women I'd chatted with at gatherings but never really connected with beyond small talk. I told them I was going through a divorce and that some difficult things had come to light about Landon's character. Their responses told me everything I needed to know. Two of the women admitted they'd never really liked Landon, that something about him had always felt performative and fake, but they'd stayed quiet because their husbands were friends with him. One of them said her husband had actually lent Landon $5,000 8 months ago for what Landon claimed was a short-term cash flow problem with a client payment. The money had never been repaid. Another woman told me that Landon had hit on her at a Christmas party 2 years ago when he thought no one was watching. She'd rejected him immediately and avoided him after that. But she'd never told anyone because she hadn't wanted to cause problems in the friend group. The more I dug, the more I realized that Landon's carefully constructed image had cracks everywhere. People had noticed things, felt uncomfortable, had doubts, but everyone had stayed silent because that's what people do. They give the benefit of the doubt, they don't want to cause drama. They assume they're probably wrong. All those small moments of cognitive dissonance that people had brushed aside were actually glimpses of who Landon really was. I compiled everything into a timeline and shared it with Nathan. He was impressed by how thorough I'd been, but he also warned me to be careful about seeming vindictive. The goal was justice, not revenge, and we needed to make sure everything we presented in court had a clear legal purpose. I understood his concern, but I explained my reasoning. Landon's defense would likely try to paint him as someone who'd made mistakes but wasn't a bad person. They'd try to generate sympathy, claim he'd been under stress or had some kind of breakdown. I wanted to make absolutely certain that the full pattern of his deception was undeniable. Nathan agreed and started incorporating my findings into our case strategy. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings were revealing more details. Landon's attorney had submitted financial disclosures that were obviously incomplete. When Nathan challenged them, Landon was forced to amend his filings 3 separate times, each version revealing accounts and assets he'd initially claimed didn't exist. The judge assigned to our case was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd seen every divorce trick in the book. After the third amended disclosure, she called both attorneys into chambers, and, according to Nathan, made it very clear that she wasn't amused by Landon's games. She ordered a complete forensic audit of both of our finances and appointed a special master to oversee the process. If Landon was found to be hiding assets, she indicated she'd consider sanctions and contempt charges. That's when things started moving faster. The forensic audit uncovered the cryptocurrency wallet, which still held $38,000 of my money that Landon had converted. The special master ordered him to immediately transfer it back to my account or face contempt of court. Landon complied, but according to Nathan, his attorney was furious. Apparently, Landon had told his own lawyer that the crypto didn't exist, meaning he'd lied to his legal representation as well. The audit also found 2 more credit cards I'd never known about, both opened in the past year using our joint credit history. The balances totaled $63,000 money Landon had spent on things he'd kept completely hidden from me. Nathan filed a motion to hold Landon responsible for the entire credit card debt as part of the divorce settlement, arguing that since he'd opened and used them without my knowledge, they were his sole liability. Everything was coming together, piece by piece. The evidence was overwhelming. Landon's credibility was shredded. His attorney was scrambling to control the damage. But I knew there was still one more thing I needed to do before the trial. I needed to face the possibility that I'd ignored warning signs, that I'd let my desire for love and partnership blind me to red flags that were probably there from the beginning. I started therapy specifically focused on understanding how I'd ended up in this situation. My therapist was gentle but direct, helping me trace the patterns of how Landon had isolated me emotionally while making me feel like I was being supported, how he'd positioned himself as my partner while systematically taking control of my finances, how he'd used my wealth against me by making me feel guilty for having it while he played the role of the struggling, hardworking husband. It was financial abuse wrapped in the language of love, and I'd been so invested in the relationship I'd wanted that I hadn't seen the relationship I actually had. The clarity was painful, but it was also empowering. I wasn't naive or stupid-eyed, been deliberately manipulated by someone skilled at deception. Understanding that difference mattered. As the trial date approached, Nathan prepared me for what to expect. Landon's attorney would likely attack my character, suggest I'd been controlling with money, implied that his affairs were a response to feeling emasculated by my wealth. They'd try to make me the villain in a story where I was actually the victim. Nathan told me to stay calm, stick to facts, and let the evidence speak for itself. But there was something else he wanted me to prepare for. He said there was a strong possibility that Landon would try to approach me directly before the trial, either to intimidate me, manipulate me, or make one last desperate plea. He was right. 3 days before we were scheduled to appear in court, I got a text from Landon's number. The first direct contact he'd attempted since I'd walked out of the Mandarin Oriental, The message was long, rambling, and clearly designed to play on my emotions. He said he'd been sick about everything, that he'd ruined the best thing in his life, that he'd been seeing a therapist and finally understood how badly he'd messed up. He claimed the affairs meant nothing, that I was the only woman he'd ever truly loved, and that if I'd just give him a chance to explain everything in person, he could make me understand. The message ended with a plea. He asked me to drop the criminal charges and settle the divorce quietly. He said he'd sign whatever I wanted, walk away from everything, just please don't destroy his life publicly. I read the message 3 times, looking for any trace of the man I'd thought I married. All I saw was another manipulation attempt. I forwarded the message to Nathan without responding, and he immediately filed it as evidence of witness intimidation and improper contact. The judge issued a formal order prohibiting Landon from contacting me in any way outside of legal proceedings. Landon's last attempt to control the narrative had just made our case even stronger. The trial was 2 days away, and I was ready. The morning of the trial, I woke up at 5:30 and couldn't fall back asleep. My stomach was in knots, but my mind was clear. I put on a navy blue suit, professional, composed, the kind of outfit that said I was someone who should be taken seriously. Nathan had coached me on courtroom presence. Speak clearly, don't get emotional. Answer only what's asked. Let the evidence do the heavy lifting. The courthouse in downtown Miami was already humid and crowded when I arrived at 8. Nathan met me outside with his briefcase and a calm confidence that helped settle my nerves. He reminded me that we had an airtight case, that Landon's attorney had virtually nothing to work with, and that the judge had already shown clear skepticism toward Landon's credibility during pretrial hearings. Still, walking into that courtroom and seeing Landon sitting at the defense table made my heart race. He'd lost weight. His suit looked expensive, but hung slightly loose on his frame, like he'd bought it when he still had access to my money and hadn't adjusted to his new reality. He didn't look at me when I entered, just kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. His attorney was a slick-looking man in his 50s who'd clearly handled plenty of messy divorces. Nathan had warned me that he was known for aggressive cross-examination tactics, but that his reputation was built more on intimidation than substance. The judge entered, and everyone stood. She was exactly as Nathan had described. Sharp-eyed, no nonsense. The kind of person who'd heard every excuse and saw through all of them. The proceedings began with opening statements. Landon's attorney went first, painting a picture of a marriage strained by financial imbalance. Claiming that Landon had felt increasingly marginalized and emasculated by being dependent on my wealth, he suggested that the affairs were symptoms of a troubled marriage, not criminal behavior, and that the financial discrepancies were misunderstandings blown out of proportion by vindictive divorce attorneys. I watched the judge's face as he spoke. She looked completely unmoved. Then Nathan stood up for our opening statement, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He laid out the timeline methodically. How Landon had targeted me deliberately after learning about my inheritance. How he'd spent 18 months systematically stealing and hiding my money. How he'd created false identities, maintained relationships with multiple women, and documented his plan to extract over $1 million before disappearing permanently. Nathan presented the storage unit findings, the cryptocurrency conversions, the forged documents, the testimonies from 4 women who'd been deceived. He showed the judge Landon's handwritten exit strategy timeline, and I watched her expression harden. This wasn't a marriage gone wrong. This was premeditated fraud. The first witness Nathan called was the forensic accountant. She walked through every financial detail with clinical precision. The $120,000 spent on the affairs, the $47,000 converted to cryptocurrency, the credit cards opened without my knowledge, the attempted loans using my assets as collateral. Landon's attorney tried to suggest that married couples often have access to each other's money, and that wasn't unusual. The accountant calmly pointed out that access and deception were very different things, and that the pattern of hidden accounts and false documentation indicated intent to defraud, not normal marital financial management. The second witness was Tessa. I'd been worried about how she'd handle testifying, but she was incredibly composed. She explained how Landon had told her he was divorced, showed her fake documents about his supposed business ventures, and convinced her he was building a future with her. She presented the messages where he'd discussed proposing to her and the screenshots of houses they'd supposedly buy together. Under cross-examination, Landon's attorney tried to make it seem like Tessa had been a willing participant in an affair, that she should have known better. But Tessa held firm, explaining that she'd been shown divorce papers forged ones. We now knew and had genuinely believed Landon was a single man, starting over after a difficult marriage. The judge actually stopped the cross-examination at one point to clarify something with Landon's attorney. She asked if he was seriously suggesting that being lied to made someone complicit in fraud. He backed down immediately. Next came Vanessa, who testified about the $20,000 she'd given Landon for his fake business venture. Then Claire, who detailed the expenses she'd covered, believing she was helping her boyfriend through financial difficulties. Finally, Madison, the youngest of the 4, who explained how Landon had positioned himself as a mentor and future partner while grooming her emotionally. By the time all 4 women had testified, the pattern was undeniable. Landon hadn't made mistakes or had a affairs. He'd run coordinated cons on multiple victims simultaneously. Then, Nathan called me to the stand. I'd been dreading this moment, but once I was actually sitting there with my hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth, I felt strangely calm. Nathan walked me through the timeline of our relationship. How we'd met, how quickly things had moved, how I'd shared my financial situation with him early on. I explained about the joint trust fund, the black card, my belief that we were building a life together as partners. Then I described the moment I'd discovered the Truth Corin's phone call, the banking app, the charges that proved Landon had never gone to Seattle. I talked about the confrontation at the Mandarin Oriental, the storage unit discovery, the letter from his ex-girlfriend revealing he'd targeted me deliberately. Nathan asked me how it felt to learn that my entire marriage had been based on deception. I looked directly at the judge when I answered. I told her it felt like my whole life had been a lie, that I'd questioned every memory and every moment, wondering what had been real and what had been performance. But I also said that discovering the truth had given me something unexpected clarity about my own worth and the determination to make sure Landon never had the opportunity to do this to anyone else. Landon's attorney's cross-examination was exactly as aggressive as Nathan had predicted. He tried to suggest I'd been controlling with money, that I'd kept Landon financially dependent to maintain power in the relationship. He implied that I'd driven him to deception by being unwilling to share my wealth equally. I stayed calm and answered every question directly. I pointed out that I'd given Landon unlimited access to my money through the black card and joint trust fund, which was the opposite of controlling. I explained that the problem wasn't sharing wealth, it was being systematically robbed, while being lied to. The attorney asked if I'd ever considered that Landon might have felt insecure about the financial imbalance in our marriage. I paused before answering that question, making sure to keep my voice level. I said that if Landon had felt insecure, the appropriate response would have been to discuss it with me honestly, perhaps seek counseling, or work on building his own career. The inappropriate response was to steal over $100,000, create fake identities, deceive multiple women, and plan to disappear with $1 million of my money. The judge actually nodded slightly at that answer. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt lighter than I had in months. I'd told my truth, stayed composed, and let the facts speak for themselves. The final witness of the day was the private investigator who'd examined the storage unit. He presented photographs of everything they'd found, the boxes of forged documents, the labeled gifts for different women, the burner phone, and most damaging of all, the notebook with Landon's exit strategy. He read portions of the timeline aloud in court. Month 13, execution. Estimated extraction, $800,000 to $1.2 million. Destination, Southeast Asia, likely Thailand or Vietnam. The courtroom was completely silent as the investigator explained what each entry meant. Landon had documented his plan to financially destroy me in his own handwriting, with dates and dollar amounts and contingency plans. When the investigator finished, Nathan rested our case. Landon's attorney called Oni to witness as a colleague from work who testified that Landon was good at his job and well-liked, and a therapist. Landon had apparently started seeing 2 weeks before the trial, who suggested he was suffering from stress and depression related to the divorce. Neither testimony addressed any of the actual evidence. They were character witnesses in a case about documented fraud. Then Landon's attorney made a decision that shocked everyone in the courtroom. He called Landon himself to testify. Nathan had told me this probably wouldn't happen, that putting Landon on the stand would open him up to cross-examination that would destroy whatever remained of his credibility. But apparently, his attorney thought it was worth the risk. Landon took the stand, looking nervous and defeated. His attorney asked him to explain his side of the story. What came out was a rambling mess of justifications and excuses. Landon claimed he'd felt emasculated by being financially dependent on me, that the affairs had been a way of reclaiming his masculinity and sense of self-worth. He said the money he'd hidden was supposed to be for a surprise business venture he wanted to start independently, to prove he could be successful without my help. He admitted the planning looked bad but claimed he'd never actually intended to go through with the exit strategy, which just a fantasy he'd written down during a dark period of depression. The judge interrupted him at that point. She asked directly whether he was claiming the detailed timeline. The cryptocurrency conversions and the forged power of attorney documents were all just fantasy. Landon hesitated, then said he'd gotten carried away with planning but wouldn't have actually done it. The judge asked if he expected her to believe that. The silence that followed was devastating. Then, Nathan stood up for cross-examination, and I watched Landon's face go pale. Nathan was methodical and ruthless. He walked Landon through every lie, every hidden account, every woman he'd deceived. He made Landon confirm that yes, he'd told Vanessa he loved her. Yes, he'd planned to propose to Tessa. Yes, he'd researched how to establish new identities in foreign countries. Nathan asked Landon to explain why someone who wasn't actually planning to steal money and disappear would need to know how to create a new identity in a country without extradition. Landon had no answer. Nathan asked if Landon had disclosed the joint trust fund access to his employer as required by company policy. Landon admitted he hadn't. Nathan asked if Landon had ever once felt guilty enough about what he was doing to stop. To tell me the truth, to give back any of the money he'd stolen. Landon's voice cracked when he said he'd felt guilty every day. Nathan looked at him with something close to contempt and asked why. If he felt so guilty, he'd continued for 18 months and had only stopped when he got caught. Landon broke down crying on the stand. His attorney tried to redirect, to salvage something from the testimony, but it was pointless. Landon had destroyed himself more effectively than Nathan ever could have. When court adjourned for the day, Nathan told me it was essentially over. The judge would review everything and issue her ruling, but the outcome wasn't in doubt. Landon would get nothing from the divorce, and the criminal referral would almost certainly move forward. I sat in the courthouse hallway after everyone had left, just breathing in the quiet. It wasn't satisfaction, I felt it was relief. The truth was finally, completely, undeniably, out in the open. Landon couldn't lie his way out of this one. The judge issued her ruling 3 days later. Landon received nothing from the marriage, no assets, no alimony, no claim to any portion of my inheritance or property. The ruling stated explicitly that he'd entered the marriage under fraudulent pretenses with the intent to financially exploit me, and that his actions constituted a pattern of systematic abuse and theft. She ordered him to pay restitution for all documented stolen funds. Though Nathan told me realistically we'd probably never see most of that money, Landon simply didn't have it anymore. The credit card debt he'd accumulated was assigned entirely to him. The house, the cars, the investments all confirmed as my sole property. But it was the final paragraph of the ruling that mattered most to me. The judge wrote that she was referring the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution, and that the evidence presented suggested violations of fraud statutes serious enough to warrant felony charges. 2 weeks later, Landon was arrested at work and charged with wire fraud, identity theft, and financial exploitation. His bail was set at $50,000, money he no longer had access to. He spent 3 days in jail before his parents mortgaged their house to post bond. I learned about the arrest from Nathan, who'd been monitoring the criminal case. He asked if I felt vindicated. I told him I just felt tired. The criminal trial was scheduled for 6 months out, but I didn't plan to attend. I'd given my deposition, provided all the evidence I had, and testified during the preliminary hearings. The prosecutors had everything they needed. Whether Landon went to prison or took a plea deal wasn't something I needed to witness firsthand. What I needed was to rebuild. I sold the house in Coral Gables within a month. Too many memories, too much space filled with ghosts of a life that had never been real. I bought a smaller place in South Beach, a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, just big enough for me and full of light. The 4 women Landon had deceived stayed in touch. Tessa and I became genuine friends, meeting for coffee every couple of weeks to talk about our lives beyond what he'd done to us. Vanessa sent occasional messages from New York, updating me on her fashion career and the new relationship she'd started with someone who actually deserved her trust. Claire and Madison checked in less frequently, but when they did, their messages were always kind. We'd all been through something terrible together, and there was a strange comfort in knowing we'd survived it. I started working again, something I'd let slide during my marriage because Landon had always made me feel like my career was optional compared to supporting his. I launched a financial consulting firm specifically for women, helping them protect their assets before marriage, identify signs of financial abuse, and recover from situations like mine. The business grew faster than I'd expected. Apparently, there were a lot of women who needed exactly what I was offering, expertise combined with lived experience. I hired staff, rented office space, started speaking at events about financial independence and recognizing manipulation. Turning my pain into purpose didn't erase what happened, but it gave it meaning. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I got a notification from Nathan. Landon had taken a plea deal, 5 years in federal prison for fraud and identity theft, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. He'd also been ordered to pay $200,000 in restitution, though the payment plan stretched over 15 years and would probably never be fully completed. His financial consulting license had been revoked. His former employer had fired him after the arrest and had quietly settled a lawsuit from the colleague, whose $5,000 was never repaid. Landon's carefully constructed life had collapsed completely. Nathan asked if I wanted to submit a victim impact statement before sentencing. I thought about it for a long time before deciding against it. I'd already said everything I needed to say in court. Anything more would just be giving Landon more space in my head than he deserved. The last I heard about him was from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned seeing him being escorted into the federal courthouse for sentencing. She said he looked broken, aged beyond his years, nothing like the charming man who used to work a room at parties. I felt nothing when she told me that. Not satisfaction, not pity, not even curiosity. Just a distant acknowledgement that the person who'd tried to destroy my life was facing consequences. A year and a half after I'd canceled that black card in the Mandarin Oriental lobby, I was sitting on my balcony watching the sunrise over the Atlantic. My business was thriving. My bank accounts were protected with security measures I'd implemented with the help of experts. My friendships were genuine and built on reciprocity, not deception. I'd started dating again, carefully and with much better boundaries. Nothing serious yet, and I was okay with that. I'd learned that being alone was infinitely better than being with someone who saw, Me as a target instead of a partner. Sometimes I thought about the woman I'd been when I married Landon, naive in some ways, but also generous and hopeful and willing to believe in love. Part of me mourned the loss of that easy trust, the ability to take people at face value without constantly looking for hidden motives. But I'd gained something too. I knew my worth now, not because of my inheritance or my possessions, but because I'd fought for myself when it mattered most. I'd seen the evidence of my husband's betrayal, and instead of crumbling or making excuses or accepting less than I deserved, I'd stood up and demanded justice. That strength had always been in me. I just hadn't needed it before. My phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a new client, a woman who'd found my website after discovering her husband had been hiding money. She sounded scared and overwhelmed and heartbroken, exactly like I'd felt 18 months ago. I told her to take a deep breath, that she'd done the hardest part by reaching out, and that we'd figure out her next steps together. Because that's what I'd learned through all of this. The betrayal wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of a new chapter where I got to decide who I wanted to be. Landon had tried to write my ending for me, had planned it out in careful detail in that notebook, but he'd underestimated something fundamental. My money might have been his target, but my resilience was something he never saw coming. The black card I'd canceled had represented more than just access to my accounts. It had been the symbol of his power over my life, his ability to take what he wanted while I remained oblivious. Cutting it off hadn't been about revenge. It had been about reclaiming myself. And now, watching the sun rise over water that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, I knew exactly who I was, someone who'd survived, rebuilt, and turned her worst experience into a mission to help others do the same. Landon was in prison, his reputation destroyed, his future limited by felony convictions and restitution orders. I was free, and that was the only ending that mattered. Before we finish, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know what city you're watching from. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. There are more tales like this one, and trust me, you'll want to hear them. Thanks for being here with me through Gemma's journey.